Forget candlelit romance. Medieval brothels were more rat-trap than red velvet. In the Middle Ages, sex work was about as illegal as traffic tickets. These days, but it came with far fewer rights. Welcome to my channel. Today we're answering the extraordinary question, why did medieval prostitutes wear bells? Scandal wasn't just whispered about, it was taxed. Across medieval Europe, city officials believed that brothels were a necessary evil. Without them, men might commit worse sins. Like sleeping with the maid or having a secret affair with your wife's best friend. Or, heaven forbid, doing the unspeakable things that would later earn Oscar Wilde a jail sentence. So they legalized prostitution, sort of. Municipal brothels popped up all over town, usually near fish markets, because why add bad smells to bad decisions? Prostitutes were licensed, meaning they had to register with the local church and swear they weren't, say, a heretic or a witch. And to avoid confusion with the clergy, prostitutes had to wear distinctive clothing, like a red hood or a yellow scarf or bells on their belt. Oh, and they also had to keep their hair shaved, or at least that was the theory. Inside the brothel, there were no feather beds or silk sheets. Just creaky wooden floors, rickety tables, and chairs and mattresses stuffed with hay. In the corner was a bucket that pretended to be a toilet. The whole place smelled like stale waste and chamber pots. Not exactly romantic, but people kept coming back. For one thing, it was rare to find privacy in the Middle Ages. Most folks lived in one-room huts with their families. If they wanted a bit of alone time, brothels were cheaper and safer than a public bathroom. Also, there were no condoms or birth control pills. So, a woman who did want to get pregnant needed a skilled professional to help her avoid an unwanted bun in the oven. For many women, though, working in a brothel wasn't a matter of personal choice. Human trafficking was alive and well in the Middle Ages, and many prostitutes were either sold into the trade or tricked into it by false promises. Once inside, most were too afraid to leave even if they wanted to. There were a few rebel prostitutes who tried to organize, like the group of women in 13th century Florence who protested their working conditions. But when the bishop threatened to unleash God's wrath upon them, they packed up their protest signs and went back to work. The only bright spot for many prostitutes was that they could earn enough money to buy their freedom, at least according to legend. Like the story of Ganelon, a French noblewoman who turned prostitute to save her family's honor after her husband died fighting in the Crusades. Or the tale of Lady Godiva, an English noblewoman who supposedly rode through the streets of Coventry on a horse while wearing only a shawl to protest high taxes. That story may have been made up by monks who wanted to distract people from, the fact that they were living in the Middle Ages, but medieval prostitutes were real. And across Europe, they faced harassment, violence, and scorn. Artists portrayed them as hairy monsters or figures of fun. People called them vile names like stinking whore or filthy slut. Religious leaders blamed them for everything from the Black Death to bad wine, which is ironic since the same leaders were profiting from their labor. To learn more ways that medieval society demonized women, check out the series in the description below. Now today, sex work is still dangerous. It's still stigmatized, and it's still criminalized in many places. But thanks to activists and organizers, many countries are moving toward decriminalization and acceptance. To learn more, visit our website. She wore red, she had a license. But she wasn't always there by choice. Welcome to my channel. Today we are exploring the lives of sex workers through history. Viewer discretion is advised as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. Red was the color of the night. It was the color of courage, confidence, a defiant slash of lipstick against the grayness of dawn. For some ladies of the evening, it was also the color of danger. When the lights were low and the shadows were long, a woman wearing red was fair game for any man with an urge. She might have been a high-class call girl charging 500 francs a night or a cheap streetwalker working for pennies. Either way, she was a target, and men who hunted them knew the rules. The lady in red was fair game. She had chosen this profession, but not all women did. While some entered brothels willingly, lured by promises of easy money, many had no say in the matter. Poverty, abandonment, or being orphaned funneled countless women into the trade. Some were sold by desperate families. Others fled worse fates. A young woman named Mary Ellen sold herself in 1868 to escape an abusive father. Her mother had died when she was 2, and her father beat her so badly that she ran away from home and into the arms of a traveling carnival. There she met a man who offered her a choice: join his traveling circus or leave with $5 in your pocket and a good night as sleep. Not exactly a hard sell. She chose the latter, arriving in New York penniless, and soon ended up on the streets. Men propositioned her. She turned them down until one offered her a job at a casino on 13th Street. "I didn't want to be a prostitute," she said later, "but I found myself in such desperate circumstances that I thought I could not do anything worse." Another woman, Helen Viola, was sold into the business by her own mother when she was 12 years old. Years later, she recalled the sting of betrayal. "I asked my mother why she did it, why she gave me to that monster, and she just laughed." Once inside the brothel, these women were far from the glamorous ladies of leisure portrayed in fiction. They followed strict rules. Most had to sign contracts agreeing to serve a set number of clients per night, 7 to 10 men each, and most of their pay, whatever the client gave them, went to the madame, who acted more like a pimp than a manager. The women were forbidden to form romantic relationships, wear fancy clothes, or, heaven forbid, fall in love. One madam went so far as to cut off a worker's balls because he got a girl pregnant. Yeah, really. To prevent the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, some cities even inspected them weekly for disease. The process involved a humiliating internal and external exam by a team of male doctors. No wonder it was called the doctor's special. Still, bonds often formed between workers, and some became fierce protectors of one another. If a new girl came in and the madam tried to hustle her too hard, the other women would stop taking clients and the madam would back off. In rare cases, a woman could earn enough to buy her freedom or even open her own establishment. But just as often, they aged out fast. By 30, they were considered too old for the game. By 40, they were broken. By 50, they were invisible. What kept them going? Sometimes it was alcohol, sometimes dreams. Sometimes it was nothing. Now, let's look at the clients. Who were they? And why were some of them priests? Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more historical tales. See you next time. The year is 1348. You've survived the plague, but your luck is about to run out because you're about to be arrested for visiting a brothel. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, killing millions, something else was spreading rapidly: syphilis. And the authorities blamed prostitutes. So, when the good Bishop of London heard that a certain innkeeper was turning a blind eye to the activities of a couple of ladies of the night, he decided to pay a little visit. Imagine his shock when he found not 2 or 3 women, but 15 of them, plus a handful of clergymen and lay people. The bishop was so disgusted that he promptly confiscated the inn's liquor license. So who visits medieval brothels? Well, pretty much everyone. Grizzled knights looking to spice up their long, hard campaigns, lowly apprentices seeking a bit of innocent fun, and yes, even some members of the clergy. Because while the church did its best to condemn prostitution as a wicked sin, many priests, monks, and bishops couldn't resist the oldest profession in the world. Let's start at the top. Despite their vows of celibacy, priests were regular visitors to brothels. Some were young, some were old. Some were very discreet, others, well, not so much. In fact, one bishop was once caught so many times with the same girl that he was forced to make a generous donation to a nunnery to atone for his sins. Talk about a scarlet letter. But it wasn't just about sex. Many priests felt lonely and isolated, and brothels provided a place where they could unwind and be themselves without worrying about what people would say. After all, there were no judgmental parishioners behind those closed doors. It was just them and their lady friends. But priests weren't the only ones looking for company. Life in the Middle Ages was tough and dangerous, and many people sought solace in brothels. Knights, soldiers, and traveling warriors came to spend their wages. They were often on campaign for months, if not years, and they got pretty sick of eating the same gruel and sleeping by the same fire. A nice warm bed and a friendly face could be a welcome change of pace. And let's face it, nobody's judging them. For medieval men, visiting a prostitute was considered a necessary evil. They knew it wasn't the best use of their money, but it was a small price to pay for a bit of excitement. Then there were the merchants and tradesmen. They spent long days on the road and even longer nights in smelly, noisy inns. When they finally reached a brothel, they were ready to let loose. Bakers, butchers, and blacksmiths were all regulars, as were farmers, fishermen, and anyone else who worked a physically demanding job. A bath, a good meal, and a hot woman were the perfect way to unwind after a long day's work. Of course, these men weren't always welcome. Fights broke out, especially when rival groups of soldiers or traveling entertainers got drunk and tried to settle their differences with their fists. That's why many brothels hired guards, usually ex-soldiers with quick fists and even quicker tempers. Being a bouncer at a medieval brothel was a dangerous job. And then there was the problem of unwanted pregnancies. If a nobleman was caught betting a local girl, he might try to make things right by paying her off. But most of them didn't stick around to see if she actually gave birth. And if a stable boy or foot soldier got a girl pregnant, well, they usually disappeared. She might have been thrown out of the brothel and left to fend for herself, or given up her baby for adoption, or even sold into servitude. In fact, many brothels took in abandoned children, both boys and girls, and raised them as their own. These kids were usually given new names and identities so that nobody would ever know what their real fathers had done. Despite all the danger and the disease, brothels were still busy. Their clients kept coming back, seeking an escape from the harsh realities of medieval life. Maybe they were looking for a chance to let loose and be someone else for a night? Maybe they just wanted to experience a bit of the forbiddance. Or maybe, just maybe, they were looking for a moment of quiet in a loud, unforgiving world. Next time, we'll follow the money. How did brothels make their profits? Did they pay taxes? And how did they become an oddly respected part of the local economy? Find out next time. In medieval cities, brothels weren't just tolerated, they were profitable. Municipalities saw sex work as a convenient revenue stream, a sort of sin tax that everyone was happy to pay except the women working in the brothels. Some cities even outright owned the brothels. Yes, your local mayor might have been your landlord and your regulator. Talk about awkward. These municipal brothels were most common in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, but popped up all over Europe from England to Italy and beyond. Usually run by a single madam, these establishments were licensed and inspected regularly by the state. Brothel owners paid taxes to the municipality based on the services provided. Some towns, like 14th century London, had fixed rates for various services, like a medieval menu, short stay, 1 coin. Full night, 3 coins, special request, double. These prices were low enough for commoners, but high enough to turn a profit. And guess what? Women rarely saw the full amount. Most kept 10 to 20% at best. Meanwhile, cities used the tax revenue to build bridges, repair roads, or sponsor religious festivals. So who paid for those special requests? Commoners did, because while these shops were technically illegal, the only raids were on the Jewish or Muslim-owned businesses. Authorities turned a blind eye to the rest. So next time you raid in a Belgian town getting busy in a bridge that was clearly built in the 1300s, you know who to thank? But brothel business wasn't just about the money. It was also about the jobs. These businesses employed cleaners, cooks, and guards, creating much-needed work in the neighborhood. Some became so wealthy they gave out loans to local merchants or sponsored a tavern or two. Hey, nothing says family fun like a good tavern. They even sponsored puppet shows. Okay, maybe that last part doesn't say family fun. Business was so good, in fact, that brothels became targets for organized crime. In the late Middle Ages, criminal gangs would forcibly recruit women into the oldest profession. Then when the women got a little too chatty about their new profession, the groups would murder them. Ooh la la. The gang that specialized in killing women who worked in the red light district was called the Night Watch, which is extra ironic considering the Night Watch was also the name of a police force created in 16th century Amsterdam to crack down on precisely this kind of behavior. That's right. By the 16th century, attitudes towards prostitution were shifting. Religious leaders started to view sex work as sinful rather than necessary. Civic leaders began to see brothels as breeding grounds for disease, crime, and general debauchery. And there was some truth to that. While most European cities enjoyed a brief golden age of brothel-sponsored cathedrals in the 1300s, by the 1500s, fear of disease and changing religious attitudes caused many municipalities to shut them down. Occasionally, though, they'd reopen once the plague outbreak or moral panic died down, like a bad rash. Luckily for history, though, we have plenty of records from these golden ages thanks to the invention of accounting. To understand how that happened, let's talk about disease. Shame and the medieval cure for STDs. The 18th century brought us some truly delightful innovations like powdered wigs, the guillotine, and the pox. That's right. Sexually transmitted diseases were widespread throughout history. And we mean really widespread. A 19th century study found that 50% of men in London had syphilis, so treatment was necessary. The problem was, medicine wasn't quite up to the task. Doctors tried everything from leeches to mercury to, don't ask me. But it seems to have involved a lot of painful things being shoved where the sun does unshine. The most popular treatment, however, was a bath. A hot bath with lots of soap. Really, we mean it. That's what they used to treat syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. Pretty simple, right? Well, not exactly. See, they didn't have Dove soap. Welcome to my channel. Today we're answering the question, what did women get from visiting a medieval brothel? But a quick reminder before we begin. Now then, what did women get from visiting a medieval brothel? Let's start with the obvious sex. But the rest of it was a mixed bag. Bad hygiene, no condoms, and medieval medicine meant the visit could result in something a little less pleasurable. On STD, in fact, brothels were considered the perfect place to catch a nasty case of the clap. So while patrons might have left with a raging hard-on, they might also be carrying something else. Something a little more silent, a little more deadly. Now, these sexually transmitted diseases are nothing new. People have been getting them for thousands of years. But during the Middle Ages, things got a little crazy. See, there were two main diseases people were worried about. One was the plague, which, yikes, killed millions across Europe and Asia. But while bubonic plague could be spread through intimate relations, it wasn't super common. The other disease was much more common, and that was syphilis. This was a bacterial infection spread through sexual contact, and it was horrible. Symptoms included painful sores, rashes, fever, hair loss, and if left untreated, it could cause blindness, paralysis, and death. Because there was no cure, people started blaming others for spreading the disease. And because people like to blame others for things, they started calling it the French disease. Don't ask us why. That's how we ended up with the French disease. Anyway, this is important. Now, back to our story. The reason STDs were so widespread in brothels was because, well, STDs were everywhere. In the Middle Ages, prostitutes were blamed for spreading disease, but they weren't the only ones. Knights, nobles, peasants, kings, literally everyone was getting these diseases and passing them around. During the Middle Ages, people believed that a woman could pass the disease to her customer without showing any symptoms at all. So anyone engaging in the oldest profession in the world was basically taking their life into their hands. The good news is that, unlike today, there was no shortage of people willing to put their hands, eyes, and ears on the job. As far as workplace safety went, medieval brothels were pretty lax. Usually, the people working there had little to no medical knowledge, but that didn't stop them from trying to help out. Sometimes their methods were just a little off. For example, one popular inspection involved a midwife or barber surgeon, aka barber, examining the genitals with their bare hands. That's right, using their bare hands. They would poke the sores, and if the pain was sharp, it meant it was a boil and not something worse. If it was worse, well, they just told the poor prostitute she needed some fresh air and sent her on her way. No sick leave, no health care, no nothing. As for treatment, we can thank the Dark Ages for some of the most disgusting medical practices ever. One method involved rubbing the affected area with mercury. Another involved letting the blood flow out of the afflicted person, believing it would remove the disease. These methods were not only useless, they were incredibly painful and dangerous. We mean, one of the most common side effects of these treatments was death. Other times, women were given herbal poultices to apply to their genitals, usually made of goat's dung and hog's lard. Yeah, that sounds nice. They were also sometimes locked up in dark rooms with cats and mice until they either died or the disease ran its course. But despite all these horrors, it wasn't unusual for women to work in multiple brothels at once. It was sort of like a medieval temp job. They didn't make much money, but they could pick up extra work whenever they needed it. And since most brothel owners didn't pay their workers by the hour or per session, it was in the girls' interest to get in and out quickly. So they took their chances with the customers. So what did women get from visiting a medieval brothel? They got exposure to possibly deadly diseases, painful and useless treatments, and maybe a little bit of money. But hey, at least they got to choose the profession. For more on medieval jobs, stay tuned. Next time, we'll answer the question, how did medieval people make money? So can you buy love? In medieval brothels, sometimes yes, but it came at a cost. Despite rules banning it, affection did bloom. Sometimes the men who visited these establishments found themselves returning again and again, bringing with them small gifts or a poem or even a marriage proposal, and occasionally a prostitute would fall for her client and he for her. But it was a risky business. A woman might lose her job, her income, and even her friends. So most love stories played out quietly with broken promises and empty coin purses. But every once in a while, a former worker would beat the odds and marry her patron and leave brothel life behind her. That is, if society let her. For even though records do show rare cases of former workers marrying patrons, whispers followed them forever. You see, once a fallen woman, always one, no matter how white the wedding dress. Now, to be clear, this was not the experience of all sex workers. There were women who chose to work in brothels for economic reasons, or because they had been sold into the sex trade or were held there against their will. Many more were simply trying to survive. All they wanted was a warm conversation, a steady client who would treat them like a person and not a product to be bought and sold. In a life built on performance, these small acts of care meant everything. It wasn't romance, but it was survival wrapped in illusion. But what happened when the brothel closed for good? The year was 1483. Catherine de' Medici was on her way to the French city of Marseille to escape the plague that was ravaging Florence. She traveled with her 2 children and a gaggle of servants, including a young woman named Isabella. When Catherine arrived in relative safety, she left the rest of her party to follow soon after. But Isabella never made it to Marseille. She was sold to a brothel instead. In many ways, Isabella's story was typical. She was an impoverished young woman who had nowhere else to go. Her trafficker found her an affluent male client and then watched as he prostituted her over and over again until she had no value left. Then he dumped her out on the street, leaving her to fend for herself. But Isabella's story doesn't end there. See, after being discarded, she turned up in a small village outside Marseille. And in that village happened to be a church where a man named Jean de Latre sat as the local judge. Jean had heard rumors about the terrible conditions in Marseille's brothels. He knew that there were more women like Isabella, so he invited her to his house, fed her, and gave her a place to sleep. Over time, Isabella opened up to him, sharing her hopes, dreams, and fears, and Jean listened without judgment. Soon enough, he began visiting her regularly. At first, it was just as a friend, but then he started bringing her gifts, fine dresses, shoes, and jewelry. And then he began visiting her in the brothels where she worked. Their relationship blossomed, but Jean could never take Isabella away from her life. She still had to work as a prostitute to survive. That is, until Jean convinced her to run away with him. They married in secret, and then he took her to live in his mansion. Finally, Isabella felt safe. But their happiness didn't last. You see, rumors about their relationship spread through the village, and people accused Jean of stealing Isabella from the brothel and living with her in sin. The local priest threatened to excommunicate Jean unless he sent his wife back to the life from which she had come. Faced with eternal damnation, Jean did the unthinkable. He took Isabella back to the brothel where she had worked before, essentially selling her back into the same life from which he had rescued her. This time, however, things were different. Isabella was older now and not as attractive as she once was. And to make matters worse, news of her scandalous relationship with the judge made it difficult for her to find clients. Unable to support herself, she turned to the one person who could help her, Zhang, but he couldn't save her. Again, society's whispers drowned out Isabella's pleas. Eventually, she was forced to return to prostitution, and that's one story of a woman who escaped a brothel only to find herself right back where she started. Because when the brothel doors are shut for good, where do the women go? This is a story about brothels. Not those fancy French ones with the cancan dancers, but the rough-hewn buildings where desperate people sold the oldest profession in the world, sex. They once stood proudly, even defiantly, in the heart of our most revered cities. Then one day they just vanished, or at least they should have. For in the late Middle Ages, holy rollers got their way. A band of reformers known as the Puritans, along with some very Catholic heavies called the Holy Office, declared war on sin. And boy, was prostitution a sin. By the 16th century, these killjoys had successfully lobbied many towns across Europe to outlaw public brothels. Sometimes they were burned down. Other times they were converted into churches or respectable-sounding buildings like this former house of ill repute in Germany, now called the Home for Penitent Women, but all that piousness did not stamp out sex work. It just shoved it into dark and dangerous corners. Here's what happened next. To tell it, let's travel back in time to a bustling medieval town square. In the distance, a massive cathedral soars heavenward, its bells tolling for vespers. At its base, a gaggle of street vendors hawk their wares, including a wily merchant who's just returned from a long journey. He's got silks and spices from the East, perfumes from France, and fine linens from Italy. And to celebrate, he's treating himself to a room at the Golden Toad, a tavern popular with merchants and young men about town. It looks like your typical medieval inn, all exposed beams and rough stone. But past the common room with its bar and fireplace lie several secret rooms, soundproofed and curtained off, each containing a bed and discreet entrance to a latrine. If you know where to look, these rooms are used for discreet trysts. And here's how you find them. You enter the tavern and approach the bar, where you ask the innkeeper for a flagon of ale. He pours it for you from a battered wooden mug and hands it over. Then you take the mug, turn it upside down, and place it on the counter. If the innkeeper doesn't immediately reach for it, then you know you're in the right place. He slides a loose brick to reveal a narrow passageway behind the bar. With a wink, you head down the stairs into darkness. This place is called a bawdy house. Despite the danger, many European cities had them. They operated in plain sight, hidden in plain sight, until the moral crusaders shut down the brothels, that is, and turned the women inside out onto the streets. Now working illegally, they had no protection from pimps or the police. The violence against them was horrific. Men beat them, raped them, and infected them with disease. Some died gruesome deaths. Many never saw a noble knight in shining armor coming to rescue them. As for the survivors, they picked up and moved to the countryside, where they continued to ply their ancient trade, working by the light of the moon in barns, haylofts, riverboats, or sometimes even catacombs. The soil drank their blood. That is how evil this work was, and yet somehow it endured. The medieval brothel might sound like an unlikely setting for a fairy tale, but they were surprisingly common. After all, who doesn't love a good story about girls in tights? Or maybe it's more accurate to say that fairy tales were surprisingly common in medieval brothels. That's because while life was tough for sex workers, it wasn't all bad. They could make good money, especially if they hustled. And there were plenty of famous clients who spent more than a few coins for a night's pleasure. Brothels also offered a degree of autonomy, which is why many women stayed in the business after getting kicked out of the convents. As one chronicler put it, they preferred to live in sin rather than in obedience. This observer was clearly a straight-laced type, not exactly the target market for a madam, but it was true. Working in a brothel gave women access to knowledge forbidden in a patriarchal society. Here, far from prying eyes and judgmental ears, women could read books, discuss philosophy, and even learn a trade. Some brothels even employed seamstresses, brewers, or cooks. In other words, they were like regular businesses, except instead of selling widgets, they were selling their bodies. It sounds a bit crass today, but this was not lost on the women who ran them. They understood that what they were selling was not some abstract concept like love, but something much more tangible. They were selling power, that's right. These women knew that the one thing their customers really wanted was to be powerful. And when you're naked on a table with someone making passionate love to you, you have that power. For a few glorious minutes, you are totally in control. Everything else in the world can just go away. No king, duke, or countess has any power over you now, only you matter. Maybe that's why the memory of these places stuck around so long. In the end, the Crusades against brothels failed to root out sin. All they succeeded in doing was driving it underground. To learn more ways that sex work survived the medieval world, check out the series in the description below. There's even an episode about a royal pig assassination. Don't miss it. And thank you for watching.